All right, it's 2 minutes after 2 p.m. It's time we should get going. All right. Thank you for attending today's session, Innovative Zoning Codes for Rapidly Changing Times. Welcome to the 2021 Joint Planning Conference, sponsored by the New York Upstate Chapter of the American Planning Association and the New York Planning Federation. My name is Mark Castiglione. Welcome back to those who attended the noon session. And I'm so happy that you're joining us to learn from these experts today. Before we get started, I'd like to thank our conference sponsor, Hodgson and Russ, and the sponsor for this session, General Code. Without our partners and our sponsors, this virtual conference would not be possible. I want to let you know that our sessions are being recorded and are available through the Eventbrite event page. As videos become available, they will be posted there so you can watch any sessions that you may have missed. For AICP planners, you can take credit for videos for recorded sessions that you view. I will be putting the CM credit number in the chat box momentarily. All attendees are muted. If you have any questions, please submit them in the Q&A box and we will address them likely after the speakers are done with their presentation. So now it is my distinct pleasure to introduce today's panelists and speakers. First is Wayne Childs. He's the Director of Business Development for General Code. Wayne has been with General Code for many years and is a member of the ICC family of companies. He spent his time at General Code specializing in developing intelligent ways to meet the unique codification needs of planning, building, and zoning professionals. He spent most of his career focused on multimedia and publishing system process and technology development. Our next panelist and speaker is Molly Gaudioso. She is the Senior Project Manager with Bergman. She has been a planning and zoning specialist for many years. Her experience in planning as a planning consultant, municipal staff member, and planning commissioner has only affirmed her belief that local land use policies and regulations are the #1 drivers of community change, for better or worse. Recognizing this, Molly is passionate about working with decision makers and the general public to develop a more common understanding of New York state law, regulatory implications, and the tools effective in achieving future growth and development vision. Our final panelist is John Steinmetz. He's the principal planner at Bergman, and he has over 25 years of experience. He stayed primarily in Western New York and the Finger Lake region, combining his passion for public sector planning and consulting services, connecting with communities and helping them affect change as they grow and thrive. John's expertise in the administration of zoning codes is comprehensive, and he's held numerous roles in the process, including sitting on the local review board, serving as municipal staff, and assisting with the development of applications, facilitating public meetings, and engaging efforts. So without any further ado, I'll turn it over to Molly to start this presentation. And thanks again for joining us.
Thanks so much, Mark. And I apologize, everyone. I came down with a cold in the last few days, so my voice has been a little shaky. I'm gonna rely, keep my mouth closed a little bit more for this presentation, and let John and Wayne and their expertise take over. But for this presentation, if you've been with some of them that we've had over the last year plus with Zoom, we try to do things a little more interactive. It can be difficult, but one of the things is using a polling tool. So we just have a few key questions. This is the information of how you key into that. When the questions come up, that information will be on the top of the page as well every time we get there. And just keep in mind that these are zeros. So it's 0, 4, 0. So these are the instructions. Hopefully you got a chance to take a look at that before we get started. So in terms of the introductions, I think, that was really a really great summary of all of our bios there. And so with that, I'm just going to kind of hand that over to John and carry us through.
Thanks, Molly. I appreciate it. Good to see everyone via Zoom as best we can. Wish we were in person, but hopefully maybe next year. Thanks for joining us. We really appreciate it. And next slide, Molly, go ahead. Oh, we're already in there. Oh,
Yeah, everybody's already doing.
you guys are cranking. That's awesome.
If there's other, feel free to put in the chat what your role is as other.
Gary's A.
Mhm.
All right. Not for profit.
All right. So our second question that we have for you are what top issues you see for the administration of a zoning code. And what we mean by that is really kind of the barriers or the issues that you've had when it comes to communicating the code information, accessing it, how it's, being understood. Any other points there, Jen, that I'm missing?
No, I think, given the audience we have, professional planners, advisory board members, people wearing both hats. So I think someone said also serving as elected officials. So I think we've got a lot of diverse perspectives, and it would be interesting to see what people have kind of grappled with over the last, 5 or 10 years.
Mm.
So varying expertise among the ZBA, limited planning board capacity to handle complex reviews, making sure codes don't overwhelm legit development. NIMBY. Oh, poor websites. There you go, Wayne.
Yep.
Praxis how to get the application. Got it. So basically limited or no online resources, process, enforcement, interpretation and consistency. We get that one a lot.
Mhm. Lack of cooperation.
Out of date jumped out at me, and I strongly suspect that there's a multiplier to that one as well.
Mm.
I'm seeing a few on enforcement. I think we've got at least 3.
And answering questions or explaining the code. Mhm.
As someone who's been on those planner calls every week, whenever for the city, yeah, explaining code can be tricky sometimes. Outdated codes, aging codes. Yeah, limited board abilities in rural areas. We're going to talk a little bit about that in a minute.
Okay.
All right. Thanks, Molly. We'll have another survey. Leave your phone or electronic logged in. We'll have another survey in a few minutes. So I'm sure I've talked to a handful of you that are in the audience, and if you've ever started talking about down the zoning rabbit hole, I'm very passionate about it. And one of the things that I've experienced over the years, and Molly and Wayne, we were kind of echoing and bouncing off ideas for this presentation, and we kind of locked on to how things were done in the past in many areas. And then I think, not to stereotype, in rural areas and smaller villages are still being done this way, where it's very linear kind of a flow of information, and whether that's information is code drafting, development review, whatever that might be related to zoning codes, it tends to be fairly limited in it. It has attorney involvement, probably a municipal clerk, and then the decision-making body, whether it's a ZBA, planning board, or elected officials doing a map amendment or something like that. So the number of players involved in zoning administration and code drafting tended to be historically very limited, and kind of was the purview of the lawyer. And then a handful of elected officials, some of which may be professional elected officials that do that, that's essentially their full-time job, or it might be a volunteer who's making no money for their volunteer time, but is doing it out of the goodness of their heart, out of devotion for their community. Next slide. I think we can all agree that it's gotten a lot more complex. The number and diversity of people that want to engage in government decision-making is I would argue, is probably at an all-time high. So One is a planner that's extremely exciting, but it also presents challenges to say, how do we write better codes? How do we create better access? What's our role in it? Next slide. And you see here on the slide, you've got the lawyer, and that's the planning graphic, but it goes beyond that. You might have design professionals in terms of an urban designer, architect, a code publisher. I'm sure I'm forgetting a few other people that can kind of help facilitate this conversation and this dialogue. I think that's one of the privileges we have as planners, is to kind of be that in-between liaison between the public good, the public values, and local government. So we're going to spend a fair amount of time talking today about two issues: aligning codes with community values. And I think a lot of the responses we just saw to that survey were out of date codes. That one of them said that don't reflect reality. I thought that was one of my favorite ones. So we're going to speak to that. And then increasing access, not just to code content, but also potentially review processes, and trying to take that, not take it out, but minimize legalese and minimize that barrier that a lot of people think of when they think of zoning and regulatory documents.
Yep. As a code publisher, I'd like to add that, this complexity that John speaks about, we've seen that over the years. If you think about basically the beginning of zoning codes as we know them, in New York City, 1916, we were basically managing just the built environment. It was about dimensional requirements, and about the effect of those dimensional requirements on next door neighbors. Now we've gone into, all kinds of issues, quality of life issues, equity issues, so
community character.
Absolutely.
Changing market trends and technologies.
And if any of you have sat through some of our code presentations in the past, this is one we've touched on before. And when I look at other industries, I'm always trying to get inspiration for my practice in other areas. And when you think about the computer industry, which is kind of an extreme example, but you look at some of these quotes from the previous decades, the chairman of IBM in 1943 said, I think there is a world market for maybe 5 computers. And then Popular Mechanics in 1949 said the computer in the future may weigh no more than 1.5 tons. And then finally in 1977, there is no reason anyone would want a computer in their home. And next slide, Molly. And when you look at how rapidly technology changes, you've got Bell's law that talks about, a new class of computing comes out every 10 years. And you look at the cell phones and the satellite phones on the bottom and how they've gotten smaller and incredibly powerful. When you turn that lens, that advancement lens on codes, I think from Wayne mentioned 1916 New York City, I think for the first 80 years of US zoning codes, I think we were pretty stagnant. And I think the last 15 to 20 has been pretty exciting, and we've kind of taken off in innovation. So we've kind of been slow to get to where we're at, and I'm happy to see where we're going. So part of the thing we want to try to have today at the end of this conversation, if possible, with technology, is some kind of interaction in terms of what's next for you, what's on your mind, what are you doing as a practitioner or decision maker that we should all be aware of to make better, more innovative codes.
And I'd just like to add to that too, this technology component, I think is easy to think about in terms of its impacts on how we access codes and how we access this information. But it also obviously has a lot of impacts on the actual content as well, right? There's a lot of facilities and uses and things that have come up over time that we need to accommodate these drastic changes in technology that often come a lot quicker than we're ready for them. And so your codes end up being reactionary. So by utilizing, we'll talk a little bit about sort of the integration of utilizing sort of acknowledging more of this technology in terms of access can also help you better sort of be prepared for and have the content ready for new technology trends and uses and things like that. Holograms from your phone. All right, last question.
So for those of you that are, practitioners in any way, volunteers, I consider that practitioners as well, decision makers. When you have a question on your local code, or maybe you're working for another community as a consultant, how often do you search online? Molly, another question we could ask is, when's the last time you opened a physical code book? That would have been another good one. Yeah, so 18%, nearly 1 in 5 do daily code searches. Nearly half do weekly.
Yeah.
You got a lot of zoning geeks on this call. I like it.
I think it's fair to say, as a zoning practitioner, someone who, I'm drafting codes a lot in a lot of different communities, one of the first things that I'll do when I'm trying to understand the context or see what's available is Google that community or other communities and zoning, and Ecode 360 pops up a lot. And that, I think, Wayne, correct me if I'm wrong, is because you informed us that that is over 90% of the municipalities that utilize online code services have Ecode 360. Is that correct?
Yeah, yep, that is. I believe 775 communities in New York State alone. So, one of the things when I speak to planners as a representative from the codification world, I often feel like I'm going to confessional. John spoke a little bit about the incredible, that sort of stagnant nature of zoning as we know it. And then there's been this incredible ramp, to address so many different needs other than just, strictly the built environment, dimensional requirements. But as a codifier, I acknowledge there's been a gap as that content sophistication has increased. There's been a gap following regarding what Molly spoke about in saying access and how you access it. And the reason why I've spent the last 7 years specifically reaching out to planners, building code officials, zoning administrators, is because I acknowledge that gap. And, with so many users in Ecode 360 now, we're able to pull out analytics that tell us that 70 to 80% of all searches in Ecode 360 on the full municipal codes are all about zoning and land use. So the reason I reach out to the planning community and to others who are accessing the zoning code, land use codes, is because you have a vested interest. You need to have a seat at the table. And, if I had a nickel for every time I showed a cool tool or, this new technology, new way of doing something to a planner, they say, I love it. That would help me. It would help my staff. It would help my job so much. But, and I know what comes after the but that decision on what's being done with codification lives with the clerk or lives with the attorney. And if there's one message I could get across today, it's find a seat at that table, because 70 to 80% of everybody who's looking at the entire municipal code is looking at your work product, your subject matter expertise, and people need to access that, or else your staff, you are spending your time answering questions that could be answered proactively, like John mentioned before about taking those calls.
And I love these data search results, Wayne. At some point in your spare time, and you're busy, I'd love to see this list of top 10 searches pre-COVID. It would just be interesting to see. I mean, we've heard, nationally and locally, people are traveling less, investing more in their property, during the last 2 years, and looking at some of these search results, lot coverage, pool. It's just really interesting that there could be a tie to, the behavioral changes that COVID has brought upon our nation, and there might not be. We don't know why people search what they search, but it would be interesting to see these results pre-COVID versus post-COVID.
I've been looking at it anecdotally, and there are definitely changes. And for those of you who do use a tool like this, you should and can have access to these kind of analytics that tell you when do people search, what are the search terms they're looking for. So if you want to make that kind of case, if you don't have access to that, ask the question, because a lot of times I know that clerks limit, they might not necessarily allow that access. A lot of times this kind of information comes free of charge. It's not anything extra. It's simply clicking a user. So if you use tools like this, you should be able to look at analytics.
And this would be a good way also, knowing what the public is searching for, what top issues might be coming into a plan update, a code update, obviously also as well.
Yeah, and speaking of COVID, as we all know, COVID has dramatically, significantly, I can't think of a better adjective to describe, how important COVID has been to pushing online public engagement, online public meetings, remote access. And the NICOM executive director quote says it very well. By all accounts, public attendance at local government meetings increased while the health risks were minimized. So I know from our public engagement efforts, whether they're formal public hearings or maybe it's more of a workshop that then gets recorded and uploaded on a community's website, whereas normally in a smaller community we might get 20 to 40 people in person. We're getting 70, 80, 90, 100 views of that same meeting. So the people looking at and being engaged in the planning process, although in a different way, the numbers our experience has been the numbers that are significantly higher. So why not respond to that? Because now the expectations have changed. You've got people looking for access from their living room chair or their home office, whether they be developers, planning commission, residents, elected officials, all the stakeholders, so many of which are on this in this session right now, are looking for increased access, better understanding of what the codes are saying or what the code's intent is, because sometimes what a code says and what the intent is aren't aligned. And we'll talk about that in a minute. And finally, does this code represent my interests or my community's best interests?
I always like to, when we're talking about this, I like to mention generational gaps in the usage. And I like to point out that, we have a generation of people who have accessed everything they need to do in their lives from a mobile device or from a laptop or from a desktop. But, it's not acceptable to be asking this new generation who can function in every other way, for example, to come into the office for something that they need regarding zoning code or application processes or whatnot. When you think about ordering a pizza, I can literally see order was taken, pizza went in the oven, pizza's in the car, pizza's now halfway to your house. Something as insignificant as a $10 pizza, but we have development processes, people's property, people's businesses. We really need to catch that gap up.
Well, and Wayne, we were sharing anecdotes preparing for this presentation, and this happened to me in the last year, actually last 6 months. I was looking to help out a family member with a code question. So I looked online, nothing. I called a clerk in a rural town out between Rochester and Buffalo. And I said, can you email me a PDF or anything? She said, no. I said, can you send me a hard copy? She said, no, you have to come in and look at it. So there are still communities out there that are quite a bit behind, some of the innovative stuff.
We're seeing some comments to that effect in the chat too, that there's a lot, of communities that are still stuck in that place. And I think one of the things that I'd like to kind of highlight, I know it's a generational thing, particularly, especially if you look at a lot of smaller communities that may not have these resources. Generationally, also, you may not have younger staffers or younger volunteers working in municipal hall that can help facilitate some of these things, which I think so just kind of is one of the ways that could be a push. As we go through, we're going to poke fun a little bit at some of these sort of more antiquated or what we talk about old school methods. But we want to emphasize that there's some pretty basic technology sort of tools or assets, and not even talking like an online publisher or anything, but just even digitizing certain things. We can talk about how that will help at the very least. And somebody else's comment there that, again, it's not just about the users from the standpoint of the public. Somebody who's looking to invest in your community, if they can't, you got to grease the wheels, right? It's the same as that impatient person with their cell phone. That investor isn't going to take and spend time to pay somebody to go down to town hall to look at it, to figure out where they can do what and how. They're going to, go on to the next community where their information is a lot more accessible and understandable. So, all right, I'll show you.
Yeah, no, so the emphasis of the arts spiel today is access and then aligning it with your community's values and plans. And I love this quote, to understand zoning, you have to have a law degree. It's so convoluted and so dense. The whole process of how buildings get built these days is so confusing and opaque to people. There really should be more transparency so people can have an understanding of what the future holds for their city /town/village.
All right. Oh. So jumping into our two concepts, Wayne, you want to kick us off with access and format?
Yeah, so I actually have already seen it in the chat. Somebody already up regarding going into the office. That's, I had my one takeaway from today. The second takeaway, if I can get anybody who has any influence to, in all those codes that my company hosts, when I open up a zoning code and I see come into the town office, the city office, the village office to see the map. That is such low hanging fruit. We can post a map, right? So we can start with that. So, available at City Hall, we can't do that anymore. We can simply post the map, get it up there. But then, from there, we can look at the quality of that, right? So if you have a zoning map and if it was done in color, but you're representing it as grayscale, and now you can't tell between the grays what zoning district you're in, if you're using a zoning map that doesn't have parcels and street names, how does somebody know where they are on that map? We really have to think about these documents and these references that we're posting with our code from the user's perspective. Can the user actually use this to do what they need to do? So I often talk about marrying procedures with the code. A lot of times I feel like we're in a silo and we're looking just code, and then the procedures over here, you really have to think from the user, from the user's perspective. Are they able to follow through the steps in a development process or an application process, information gathering process? Are they able to get step to step to step? If not, that's a phone call or that's a visit, and that's your time, your staff's time. We need to cut down on that, communicating proactively. So again, in formatting, if we're writing a code, one of the best practices, we're going to talk a little bit more in detail formatting wise a little bit later, but if we're burying, for example, allowable uses, if we're burying them in multiple zoning districts in a code, if you're putting those in, R1, R2, C1, C2, B1, the same thing over and over and over again. If you update that code, if you take that use out, if you add a use, it has to be done in multiple places. Using overly complicated language. We should be writing in plain language. We should be writing in a way that people can actually, the way they communicate, the way that they understand it. And we have to have good organization. We have to have good numbering schemes. We can't have, unstructured content because it's not referenceable in meetings. It's not referenceable in applications. It's not referenceable, if things go to litigation. We have to be able to reference everything in a zoning code. So better publishing, start getting toward better practices, creating, working in digital databases. So, this isn't simply posting a PDF necessarily, it's putting it in a way. We talked a little bit about analytics. One of the huge benefits you get from posting structured content online in a portal that allows you accessibility to analytics to see who's using it, what are they accessing, what are they searching for. Being able to do things like multi-code searches, so those of you who aren't working for municipalities, there's a good percentage today who are doing consulting work. You want to do things like multi-code searches instead of having to go to each site. If you can go in and you can say, show me within, a certain number of distance of X zip code, show me all of the towns, population under 10,000, and you can return those kind of results, saving you time and effort. I spoke before about removing unnecessarily legalese. Basically, it's about reducing pages. I just got back from the APA conference in Pennsylvania yesterday, and one of the big topics at that was there's sort of a competition going on with planners to try to see how many pages they can cut out of zoning rewrites. How can we compress this? How can we go from 300 pages to 50 pages? And some of the work I saw was great. And a lot of that's pulling the legalese out, explaining things 3 or 4 times that can be replaced with a photograph or an illustration or a diagram or a good table. Using tables is by far the #1 improvement I see from our clients in improving their zoning codes, as far as getting users to be able to understand the content, be able to get in and out quickly. Again, a user-centered focus. How quickly can a user get into your code, find what they're looking for, absorb it, and then move on to the next step without calling for clarification? That's the success. So we talked about numbering is very important. Planning for updates. So numbering schemes can be fairly complicated. A good one allows for updates over time because zoning codes are living, breathing documents. I once heard somebody say to me, if I do a good job writing this code, it will never need to be updated. The client started belly laughing because that's just not the way these things work. So we have to plan for the updates that reflect changes in our communities through good organization of the code. So organizing topic, go ahead.
No, and Wayne, one thing, it's a level of mild criticism as some of my peers. I've seen some planners that also do code, and they'll create codes that look like plans, and they might look wonderful, but numbering isn't as critical in a plan. You've got sections, you've got chapters, you've got subheadings, and that's enough. You've got to be a little more anal retentive and a little more attention to detail when it comes to code writing, because as someone who worked at staff and we had to approve applications or deny applications, I needed to reference specific sections and paragraphs and code sections time and time again. So the basics of code drafting needs to include some of these boring things like numbering.
Right.
I think,
yeah.
and I would say, I think also, just somebody that's kind of looking at this, you spend a lot of times in codes, particularly if you're, municipal planner, you might be that person that can recall that one section number, 127-4B, because you use it all the time. But one of the things that I have started thinking about with just simply numbering, and I can't take full credit for this, a lot of this comes from you too, John. But the thinking about the numbering, instead of just, okay, let's make sure we have all of our numbers, which are important, particularly in a single code section like zoning. If you establish and you start just keep all of the various topics that are kept within the code in one section nice together, right? That's a big thing when I get into codes to help people update them, look at them. Excuse me, it's kind of all over the place. District regulations over here, parking regulations over here, with parking regulations over here. It's kind of a whole mess, right? So if you pull all that together, you put those in some specific organized sections, and you use sort of an intuitive numbering system. So for example, this on the page here, part 3 of the Village of Hamburg zoning code that we're helping them update is then subsequent articles that all start with A3. So I know if I'm going to look for some kind of development standard, I know it's going to be in Article 30 to 39, right? Or something like that, as opposed to, instead of, say you have 50 articles, you don't have to, go back or more, go back and scan through all of them. You can take you right to about the right section you want to be. So it's even taking it that one more step up instead of just getting it out on paper. But, and making sure that there is a number to reference, but does it also make logical sense?
Right. And again, to give you a helpful hint on how you can help keep your costs down and maintaining the code from a codifier's perspective, what Molly just mentioned about, if those development standards are appearing 7 times in 7 different articles, if you're putting them in one common place, if you make updates to that, the cost drops for those updates that are being done to the code.
Yeah, we worked with a community that 3 communities share the same code enforcement officer, 4 communities share the same code enforcement officer. And all of the zoning codes were entirely different. And they should be, because there were different villages with different visions, values, a town with different vision and values. But it didn't mean that the residential districts couldn't be Article 20 in every code. So that he could then go, okay, I need information from a residential district. Doesn't matter if I'm looking at this village or this town, I know I'm going to Article 20. The information might be different, but it's a similar number. All right, excellent. So then going into the alignment content component of this, one of the things before we leave this that I saw in the chat too was, we're in transition. I like to think that, the the bad quote unquote that we've had is really obviously where everything started. I mean, we didn't have computers to digitally produce all of this at one point in time. The transition or the better is us either in some example that were mentioned, scanning things in so they're released online and accessible, or maybe digitizing them. Maybe then, it's not the scanned version anymore. It's actually a typed version. It's a new version, maybe with some document links, things like that. But regardless, there's still that end piece of tracking. And that's what I think is really important when we get to the best a thing that we talk about for Wayne, we kind of to talk about as part of that too, is making sure that everything is tied together and you're not losing these loose ends as different efforts come forward and you update this local law. Well, that exists over here and we forgot and it was on this page of the website. So, there's a municipality we helped update their code, and the code we helped them update and watch them adopt isn't actually on their website. So it's their old one. That's not helpful. So for the actual content of your zoning, aligning that with your plans or your community vision, I'd say bad. And the thing that's we quote unquote say bad, and the thing that we see a lot and that really just results in a lot of issues is either it's so outdated or it's not contextual at all to your community. Maybe it's a copy and paste. Maybe I'm a village and true story, we're a village. We copy and pasted a residential zoning district that a town was utilizing that had a minimum lot size requirement of 1 acre. And now I have made almost the entirety of my residential properties non-conforming, right? So there's no, we've just there's no context there. We're just kind of having the regulation. And this is where that disconnect can be, right? Where if it's that sort of top down, you're either fully legal or fully sort of administrative one way versus fully planning, like John was saying before. You could have a really great code with a terrible format, right? Or you could have, a really great format, but not a great code, right? All those regulations I just mentioned, minimum acre, lot size, all that could be in a table. That's great. It's not serving your community very well at all. So both sides need to be speaking to each other. Otherwise, you can have overly restrictive regulations as well. Same thing, a very large setback requirement. Why? Well, that's what we saw in such and such community, or that's what worked over here, whereas in this example renders this corner parcel, particularly almost useless and undevelopable. Another bad is, in the actual direct, so not just existing conditions, but now we're talking your actual vision. So for example, we were helping City of Geneva with their zoning code update. As we're doing that, and they had previously updated their comprehensive plan, identified that this area, I know it's hard to see, but this orange area right here, which is currently zoned industrial, in the comp plan, they had identified that as being more desirable for a residential infill development. Well, under their current zoning code, this is what's allowed. This is what their plan might say that they want, but their code is letting that in. The floodgates are open for that. And as this is the thing that I'm most, interested about, is the fact that your code's your code, for better or for worse. So, this could ultimately allow you to take actions that are contrary to what you want to see. So in the alignment process and going through and helping them update their code, we took a look and as practitioners took guidance from the comprehensive plan to create a district that reflected what they were looking for. And we tried to make sure, that we had regulations that specifically speak to what their goals were. And that can go beyond, right, that singular just district or use in and of itself. This is one thing, I think in best practice right now, we're getting very good or getting better at our planning efforts and updates, and then consequently, following up with our regulatory updates. But it's hard to demonstrate to the public the connection between the two. But for example, in this code, we asked question, all right, so in a central business district area, which one of these images did you like better of the series of images? Do you feel strongly enough about your preferences between these images to regulate the difference? The community said yes. So we put that into, the zoning code. We put specific requirements into the zoning code that prevents the bad that they don't want to see from happening, right? It doesn't have to be, maybe it's just a guideline situation, but this is one of those situations where it's a better alignment now, that we've actually started to bring that into code instead of just saying, well, we have a comp plan and it says what our community character is, and we've identified this district as residential. You can go that step further, certainly as part of your code. Which brings us into what would be best practice, integrating alignment and access.
Yeah, I think in terms of when we were talking about best practice, my mind always commingles process and product. And I think that's okay. I think that's just kind of inherently being a planner. But I think best practice starts with process, so that, reaching out is a process. So, reaching out to the community and all those diverse interest groups I mentioned at the top of the hour, and then the professionals, whether it be legal professionals, design professionals, codification professionals, but bringing them all to the table, but making sure that that codification piece is kept in mind from the very beginning. I think Stephen Covey said, begin with the end in mind. So, when you're starting to draft a sophisticated code document, whether it's visual, whether it's just text on a page done in an interesting way that's visually interesting to make it more accessible, and you don't want to lose that, because if you lose the white space and it becomes more word heavy and harder to read and harder to get through when it goes to the publishing end, then that's a lost opportunity for everybody, from the planner, the publisher, and the community, obviously. So the idea is that planners and publishers really need to work together to go through format, content, legal issues, consistencies, all of the things that make a great code or a really bad code.
Usually the way I describe it, from my perspective, is I feel like there's some really great work done in, rewriting zoning codes. Somebody writes a form-based code, a UDO, or just a general rewrite. And that work product is done, and it's put down on the desk, whoever was responsible for getting that done from the municipality side. But then there's a natural silo where it's then thrown over the wall to the clerk, because it's the clerk's responsibility to then get it codified. What we're talking about is working together. Let's stop the throwing it over the wall and have a planful, thoughtful process, so that, the end product, which is, again, user-centered, who's actually going to be using this? It's not just the clerk, it's not just whoever's job it was to have the zoning code rewritten in the municipality. It's for the users. It's for everybody. It's for the constituents of the community. So that being said, John mentioned, when it comes to publishing and format, we've seen this huge, again, the huge increase in the use of, really nice illustrations, tables, well formatted, well laid out. My background is graphic design. I'm not a code guy. And my sensibilities were really offended. I talked before about having to confess when I open dialogues with planners, because I feel like codifiers in the past have done an absolutely horrible job with replicating some really well-designed, beautiful documents, trashing the graphics, violating the page layout with thoughtful white space, with relationships like you see on the screen, where you have a specification and an example. Well, that's meant to be read left to right, not on one page and then one on the following page. So, a lot of work has been done to be able to replicate, so those, the documents as they were created will live visually all the way through the final presentation as a final codified product that's presented to the public for use. So, we talked a little bit about coming to the town office to see the map on the wall, and then we work towards, okay, let's put a zoning map in our online code. We're getting better. And then the best, I actually saw a note in the chat just a little while ago about some communities do not have access to GIS. There are now all kinds of options for very cost-effective interactive zoning maps. So when I say a zoning map, it's not simply clicking on that and then seeing what district I'm in, that's sort of the easy side of the GIS or interactive map part. It's how do I click on that and get very specific information so that I don't ever even have to go over to the code and read the whole text of the code. So, if you're clicking on parcels, you're bringing up very granular information. You're seeing not only what zoning district I'm in or what overlays apply to that district, but also, things about design standards and what are the allowable uses, all within one tool. So that's how you sort of know you've reached that best class is, the better or the good is when I start linking resources. I can go to my online code portal, I could click on a link, then go to a map. Now, if you're able to create tools that actually tie together and pull zoning information and present it in one time and place, where a user in 2 or 3 clicks can find out where in a community can I put a particular business, you've reached the mark. This is a really big one for me now. This is a big strategic effort for us coming up in the next year, is tying together the comp plan, on the codification side, of course, because for planners, this has been going on forever, right? You have to tie, the zoning code has to be tied to the comp plan, but that hasn't happened for the end users who go online or go look at in code books where, online, we have the capability to tie together documents of many different kinds. So as a best practice, what we're suggesting is get those comp plans close in proximity to the zoning code, because the zoning code basically tells a user what regulations apply to them or their property. But then the next question is often why, or a detailed question or a challenge. If you can tie right to the comprehensive plan and it's co-located, and even better yet, if you're able to provide internal links that reference back to the comprehensive plan from the zoning code, now you're answering questions. And again, you're not getting visits to the counter, you're not getting phone calls, you can proactively answer questions.
And I would say too, so, again, understanding that, the best here is speaking in that sense as a tool, utilizing sort of the best technology and tools available. But I think that there's one piece to that from the content side that's really important. As I mentioned before, and we went all the way back to the beginning, why and how does the public understand that what's in the code is actually working for them and their vision and their values? And how can you demonstrate that? And one of the ways that we did that in process, and that I think can be done, if you don't have the ability to, go full Monty with all posting everything that you have online, at least keep the zoning components in the frame of mind from your comprehensive plan or whatever your future land use plan is, and that starts to identify and show why it is that you've created these certain regulations. And we did this in person once with the Village of Pittsburgh updating their comprehensive plan and their code at the same time. We created these series of boards, right, that showed, highlighted one section on the future land use map or community enhancement strategy map that, was Northern Gateway. And we paired that with the corresponding proposed zoning district. And that gave more than just the idea that, well, here's what we want to see here, wouldn't this be great? And it came right in and said, and here's how we're going to do it. Here's what the dimensional requirements say that apply to this. Here's how, our design requirements align with the placemaking elements that were, set forth for this section. So those are, that was sort of like a real-time way to do this. And that got us sort of thinking, okay, well, we have mapping for interactive mapping for zoning. We've seen interactive mapping for planning and all other types of purposes, lots of GIS applications. A great example, the city of Rochester, if you weren't familiar, just recently completed comprehensive plan update. And the entirety of the future land use plan, or the vision, what they call the placemaking plan, is an interactive map on the website. And if you click on one of these areas, it takes you to, oh, here's the description of what that character area is and what it means, and here's some visuals, et cetera, et cetera. So a great, more accessible way, right, for the community to access that. What if you had both of those together. What if the plan is one layer and the zoning's the other layer? And you can directly say, okay, well, I'm in this, this zoning district, and instead of just having that zoning different district reference and say to achieve the purpose and goals established in the comprehensive plan, you say to achieve the purpose and goals of such and such section of the comp plan. You click that, boom, it's there. It shows you sort of these alignments. There's a lot of planning based, land use considerations that aren't necessarily codifiable, that could then be demonstrated. So that, this was sort of like, as we got talking about this session and talking about innovation, there's a lot of different ways, things that we've seen to innovate the tools that exist, innovate the approach that we've taken, both in updating them, presenting them to the public, and having the general public access them, but also innovation, I think, in the ability to completely demonstrate and ensure that your long range vision is actually being supported and implemented by your land use law. Right, because at the end of the day, your comp plan can say one thing, but if the zoning code, if you say, no, you know what, walkability downtown is of prime importance, so in your comp plan, all it talks about is walkability, but you still permit drive-throughs in the front yard by right in your downtown Main Street district, there's nothing you can do about it. So that's where, this is that important overlap. And so we'll stop. I think we've got looks like 7 minutes for questions. We do have some questions coming in.
Molly, one thing just to piggyback on what you said, that last slide, which I like a lot. And then I think about what Wayne said in the beginning of the presentation about, how many people in our generation live through their phones and access information through their phones. So when I was looking at that map comparison on the last slide, I'm like, combining the two and then putting it in the palm of your hand, I think is like the platinum standard. How do you get that down to your phone or your tablet in a reasonable way?
Yeah. I mean, that was one thing, we see this a lot when we come in and we do zoning code updates. Maybe there was a plan update or something that did that, a plan effort that talked about wanting design guidelines for some area of the community. We're hired to come in and help establish those design guidelines or design standards. We get to the end of the process and somebody in the community says, well, what do we even need these for? Where is this even coming from? If you have the ability to just wholly tie and say, well, look, we did this plan and the community came out and said, here's these are our hell no's. This is the stuff we don't want to see. Remember that bad sort of good image of this is the hell no. Well, at the very least, then your code should reflect that. And it's a lot easier to demonstrate and create a more community mindset around your code rather than my property specific. If you have that planning, that general planning community vision to back that up. All right. Do you want to tackle some of these questions?
That last question is a great question. The last one that just came in. How do you get decision makers? I'm trying to paraphrase. It's a really long but very well worded question. How do you get decision makers to pay attention to a code update rather than just doing it piecemeal because their attention might be focused on more exciting quote planning efforts or other priorities for a community? Hopefully I'm paraphrasing that well to the anonymous person. I think I'm a glass half full kind of person, but I do think one of the best tools for communicating the value of updating a code and streamlining a code and making it more transparent and aligning with your community's values and priorities is to talk about risk. I think there's whether risk of getting inappropriate land uses in your downtown, Molly mentioned the drive-through. I'm not anti-drive-through, but I don't necessarily think they belong in urban dense areas sometimes. So, the risk of losing historic architecture because of a drive-through, or potentially risking turning away new economic development opportunities because your code addresses older economies. So I think talking in terms of risk and opportunity is probably one of the more helpful ways to do it. Not trying to scare elected officials, that's not the point, but just saying this is what your code says, even though your plan might say this, or your values might be this. Your code is where the rubber meets the road, and it's not consistent. So I think talking about risk and opportunity, potentially opportunities lost when it comes to economic development and investment is a good way to approach that conversation.
Yeah, I completely agree. And, I'd like to add, the sense of urgency in the title, like rapidly changing times. A lot of what we talked about today, some of the, some of the social things, some of the technology things that are driving this increased, change in zoning codes and what, they're becoming far more aspirational in nature. A lot of that has been accelerated by the pandemic. They were already in place and we already saw the curve, but the pandemic definitely accelerated these changes. So, the time is right, the excuses, they're really going to be scrutinized. Now, if you're saying, my zoning code was written in 1968, we've only made updates, there's no way that it's serving your community now. And there's going to be more and more scrutiny for various reasons very quickly.
Wayne, maybe you have an answer to this question. I have thoughts, but I'm sure you have probably a better answer. Do you have any examples of towns that have good ways of posting the applications before the planning boards and ZBA for public access? We post an agenda package, but that may mean that the full application is scattered across several months of agenda packages.
Yeah, so, agenda, the packets, that's probably not the way to do it. I do have some, if you'd follow up with me, I think my email is posted right there. If you follow up with me, I'll give you a couple examples, but it's more in, sort of in that good, better, best. Simply posting PDFs for somebody to complete and hand in is better than just having paper that they have to come into the office. So you have paper in the office and you could post PDF documents all the way right to, I could also reference some communities that are actually doing on the online development process that walk you right through procedures. So that best scenario is, we have an online code people can read. We have an interactive map. It's tied to a comp plan. From the interactive map, it actually walks us through procedures and can walk you through the procedures and feed you right into electronic permitting. And it's not, the costs have really, if you looked at it 5 years ago, 10 years ago, the costs are plummeting. More and more players are in the marketplace now. It's more competitive. And there's some really good solutions because of advancements in technology that have really lowered that cost to get in there and do that full digital solution.
I would say too, just to pick up back on the idea of the packets versus the applications, right? So you have your packets that change every month that go out to your review board members. And then you have your packets of information that come in with applications. It starts with X amount of information, but might change from meeting to meeting. Rather than, clearly posting that the packets is fine, that's fine. That's one thing. But as you said, all right, now maybe I have to know and go back and say, well, when did this first come in front of this board so I can see the first version of this drawing? If you instead reverse that, or in tandem to that, I would say, just track the information. Maybe it's a file, you're online and it's just a link to a page and here's this application number and here's all the files associated with it, right? And I know like this happens a lot, but right, so, there's a site plan and then the next one that's updated and whatever might be sent to you and it's titled site plan XYZ _ X, like all this other stuff. It doesn't make sense. I strongly urge you, it is very simple, but I strongly urge you to just rename. If you are reposting and you got a new site plan, just very simply site plan, that's the original date. We got a new one, site plan _ the new date, right? So all of that information is then about for that one application in one spot. So the actual, packet, that serves its purpose and that could be accessible, but the individual application information can be relatively easy to track. I know it can be hard if you have a lot of applications, but can be relatively easy to track and maintain. we're at 3:01. I know we have 3 questions, or at least. We
Well,
wanna-
if you still have time, go for it.
Oh, all right. So let's go back. This one was one of the first ones we got. What can we do to encourage a change to the open meetings law to enable continued video conference meetings, preferably without requiring transcripts if the recording meeting is posted? I'm gonna leave me at stay where I I'll let you do that, John. Maybe that's a good question for you.
For me or for Mark?
Oh, I would just say, contact your state elected officials.
That's where I was going.
I would find, now this is me and I am an optimist. I think we would be hard pressed to find, for this to go backwards. I think the expectation's been put out there and it is there, for a lot of these things. We had planning processes that were started pre-COVID. We had planned in-person meetings. Then we had to kick to do all virtual. And now a lot of our clients, a lot of our projects are, well, we don't want to go all the way back because like John said in the beginning, the hybrid is, it's a little bit of a bear to figure out at first. Okay, do we have a room that can video conference and have people in it? I don't know. It's a little tricky to figure out, but I dare say we're not going to go backwards in that sense. Certainly want to contact, representatives to make sure that stays on. And I would add on to that, not just to say we like what's been happening, but these functional adjustments that you're mentioning here too, right? If it's fully available online, I would say that the difference is accessibility with transcript. So, there's some considerations for that, whether you have translators, captioning, or transcripts, things like that. But then also the idea that right now, New York State Opens meeting law says that the only thing you have to do as part of one of your public notices for a public hearing is to post it in a newspaper of general circulation. I don't get a newspaper. I don't read a newspaper. There's a zero chance that if everything in the city that I live in happened by posting to a newspaper, I would ever know about it. Social media is not your friend if you're not on there watching and hearing what's happening, right? So we as communities and as planners can start to get in front of that. I would start to say it's time to start urging the state to understand and recognize that those are important tools that bare minimum, the newspaper isn't enough anymore. That to me, that's bad practice. I would say at the very least, we have the ability to put some more things accessible online in some way through free platforms, through a website, through something else. But that's my 2 cents, and I'll
I have a quick hot opinion and an anecdote to share. The hot opinion is we have already started going backwards in some rural communities where during the pandemic, we were putting public meetings online and people were able to engage and watch and know what's going on, and they have gone away. So that is happening. The little anecdote is I lived in Maine for 10 years, from the years of 2002 to 2012, and we had community access cable. Every public meeting was on TV, and later in those 10 years, all of our public meetings were online before the pandemic. And that was a town of about 2,700 people in Maine. We can do better, and we should advocate for better in New York State.
Yeah, and Alicia, I hope is how I pronounce your name. I totally understand that, and that's all the more reason, in my opinion, for those resources to be established from the state, from counties, getting some of these trainings out. I mean, it sounds silly, but like I've done trainings to tell the public how to go to a municipality's website and interpret the things that they're seeing there. I would 100% do a training on how to get municipalities to, get set up some of these things and host meetings and all of that stuff. I mean, certainly, not everybody's in the same place and has the same capability to adapt, but we still need to push the needle, I think, on that.
Well, I think we're at time.
Okay.
And really compelling session. I will say in terms of virtual meetings, I haven't had a problem making a quorum in the past year and a half with my public boards. So certainly myriad benefits to the virtual format. Thank you, John, Wayne, and Molly. That sounds like a great band name. I'd like to buy tickets to that show. But a very compelling session, lots to dive into here. Recordings of this session and all the other sessions of the conference will be available on the conference webpage. We will take it up again on Friday with planning for flood resilience at 12 p.m. Thanks again for you all for attending, and thank you to our speakers. Take care.
Thanks.